She was on her knees, scrubbing marble so clean it reflected the crystal chandeliers above. When the billionaire laughed, surrounded by powerful men in tailored suits, he pointed at her like she was part of the decor. A joke, a moment of cheap amusement. He called her stupid, loud enough for everyone to hear. Laughter followed. What he didn't realize was this: the woman gripping the mop wasn't weak, uneducated, or invisible. Her silence wasn't feared at IT, was calculation. Point one careless joke. Point one public humiliation. And the most dangerous mistake a powerful man can make: underestimating the wrong person. Stay till the end, because what this simple waitress does next will shatter everything he thought he controlled. To the members of the elite London club, Sophie Bennett barely existed. She moved silently between marble pillars and gold-trimmed tables, mopping floors that cost more than her monthly wages. Her uniform blended into the background, just another shadow cleaning up after billion-pound deals and whispered power plays. Men in tailored suits stepped around her without slowing down. Conversations never paused. No one asked her name. She was quiet, polite, invisible. Every night, she listened while fortunes changed hands. She wiped fingerprints from crystal glasses still warm from champagne toasts. She erased evidence of success that wasn't hers to keep. To them, she was furniture, useful, unnoticed, replaceable. But invisibility wasn't Sophie's nature. Behind those gentle eyes lived a mind trained to question, analyze, and solve. Years earlier, she had sat in crowded Cambridge lecture halls, scribbling complex equations faster than most could follow. Professors had praised her insight. Friends had spoken of futures in finance, technology, and research. She had dreams that stretched far beyond cleaning floors at midnight. Then life intervened. A family crisis, crushing medical bills, promises made out of love that turned into chains. One difficult decision became many, and slowly, Sophie stepped off the path she'd worked so hard to reach. Not because she lacked ability, but because survival demanded sacrifice. She learned something far more dangerous than theory. She learned how powerful people behave when they believe no one important is watching. She learned how arrogance grows in rooms filled with money. She learned how men reveal their true selves when they think the woman with the mop can't understand their words. Sophie wasn't invisible by choice. She was invisible by necessity. And the man who would soon mock her intelligence, who would laugh and try to expose her as dumb for sport, had no idea he was standing in front of someone who saw far more than he ever could. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, that he was about to learn how wrong he was. Thomas Ashford had never been told no in his life. Money had ensured that. Power had reinforced it. By 45, he had built an empire spanning private equity, energy, and offshore investments. An empire protected by lawyers, fueled by greed, and admired by men who wanted to be him. Wherever Thomas went, rooms adjusted to his presence. Conversations softened. Egos bent. That night at the elite London club was no different. The private dining room glowed under warm chandeliers as crystal glasses clinked and plates of untouched gourmet food cooled. Around the table sat hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, and political insiders, men who spoke casually about sums that could change thousands of lives without blinking. Thomas was bored. The deal had gone smoothly, too smoothly, and boredom, when mixed with arrogance, often searched for entertainment. That's when he noticed Sophie. She had entered quietly, pushing a cleaning cart along the edge of the room, careful not to interrupt. Her eyes were lowered, focused on her task. To Thomas, she wasn't a person. She was background noise. He snapped his fingers. The sharp sound cut through the conversation. "Hey," he said lazily, not even looking directly at her. "You, cleaner." The room went quiet, anticipation flickering across a few amused faces. Sophie stopped. Slowly, she turned toward him. "Yes, sir," she said calmly. Thomas smirked. "You hear the numbers we're throwing around here every night." He gestured at the table. "All this money talk must sound like a foreign language to you." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Sophie didn't respond. She waited. That only encouraged him. "Tell you what," Thomas continued, leaning back in his chair. Let's have some fun. He picked up a pen and scribbled figures onto a napkin. Percentages, projections, compounded returns. Simple finance question. Even you should be able to take a guess. He slid the napkin toward her like a dare. If an investment grows at this rate, he said smugly, what's the final return after 5 years? Go on. Humor us. The men around the table leaned forward, smiles sharp and expectant. This wasn't curiosity, it was spectacle. They were waiting for her to stumble, to prove, publicly, that she belonged exactly where she was. Thomas folded his arms, enjoying the moment. No pressure, he added with mock generosity. It's just numbers. Sophie looked down at the napkin. For a heartbeat, the room assumed they'd won. Then something shifted. Her eyes didn't dart around in panic. Her hands didn't tremble. She didn't laugh nervously or apologize. Instead, her gaze sharpened, focused, precise. She tilted her head slightly, rereading the figures, not like someone guessing, but like someone checking another person's work. She reached for the pen. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Oh, this should be good. Sophie recalculated silently. No phone, no calculator, just her mind, moving quickly through compounding variables, assumptions, risk weighting. She saw the flaw almost instantly, and that's when she spoke. Your projection is wrong, she said softly. The room froze. Thomas laughed, loud and dismissive. I'm sorry, what? You've applied linear growth assumptions to a compounding model, Sophie continued, still looking at the napkin. And you've ignored the volatility factor you mentioned earlier. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Thomas straightened in his chair. You're saying I made a mistake? She nodded. Yes, sir. The word sir wasn't submissive. It was professional, controlled. She adjusted the numbers with quick, confident strokes. If you calculate it correctly, the return isn't what you claimed. It's lower, significantly lower. Thomas snatched the napkin back, irritation flashing across his face. He scanned it quickly. Then his expression changed. He checked again. Silence spread like a held breath. One of the men leaned closer, frowning. Another quietly did the math on his phone. A third cleared his throat. She's right, someone murmured. Thomas felt heat crawl up his neck. That error, Sophie added gently, would cost you millions over 5 years. Possibly more, depending on exposure. The laughter was gone. Completely. For the first time that evening, Thomas Ashford wasn't the smartest voice in the room. He wasn't admired. He wasn't untouchable, that he was exposed. The men who had laughed moments earlier avoided his eyes. The power dynamic shifted, subtle but undeniable. Thomas felt it, the way respect drained when certainty cracked. Who are you? He asked sharply. Sophie met his gaze for the first time. My name is Sophie Bennett, she said, and I clean this room after people like you leave. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply handed the pen back and returned to her cart. Thomas watched her walk away, his chest tight with something unfamiliar and embarrassment. In one careless joke, he had tried to make her small. Instead, he had made himself feel insignificant. And though he didn't know it yet, that moment, meant as entertainment, had just set something irreversible in motion. That napkin held more than numbers. As Sophie turned back to her cart, something pulled at her, an instinct sharpened by years of loss. She hadn't meant to look again, but the ink caught her eye, a name scribbled beneath the calculations, almost casually, as if it were meaningless. Hartley Tower. Her breath caught. For a moment, the room disappeared. The chandeliers, the murmuring men, the weight of humiliation still hanging in the air. All Sophie could see was that name, burned into her memory like a scar that never faded. Hartley Tower wasn't just a building. It was her childhood. She remembered running through its halls as a girl, her laughter echoing against polished stone. She remembered standing on the rooftop with her father, the city stretching endlessly before them, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder. That, he had once told her, pointing to the skyline, is what honest work builds. Her father, Edward Bennett, hadn't been a billionaire, but he had been respected. He built Hartley Tower from nothing, brick by brick, loan by loan, through transparency, patience, and relentless integrity. It housed small firms, charities, startups trying to survive. It wasn't just profitable. It was fair, Then Thomas Ashford arrived at IT. First, it was subtle. Inspectors appeared more frequently. Licenses were questioned. Rumors circulated about structural concerns, ones no previous report had ever mentioned. Sophie's father fought them, confident truth would protect him, that he was wrong. False violations stacked up overnight. Bribes were paid quietly. Banks withdrew support after receiving confidential risk assessments. Tenants were pressured to leave. Lawsuits drained resources faster than they could be defended. Sophie remembered the sleepless nights. Her father hunched over paperwork at the kitchen table, glasses slipping down his nose, hands trembling not from age, but stress. "This will pass," he kept saying. "We've done nothing wrong." But honesty doesn't stand a chance when power decides otherwise. Within months, Hartley Tower was seized under forced liquidation. Thomas Ashford acquired it for a fraction of its value, praised publicly as a strategic genius who had rescued a failing property. The truth never made headlines. The pressure destroyed her father. The man who once stood tall in boardrooms collapsed quietly at home, his heart giving out after yet another threatening letter arrived. Sophie had been the one to find him. The memory never left her. Her future collapsed with him. Cambridge became impossible. Tuition vanished with the estate. Legal battles swallowed what little savings remained. Sophie traded lecture halls for late-night shifts, dreams for survival. And Thomas Ashford? He prospered. Standing in that dining room years later, mop in hand, Sophie finally understood something she hadn't dared to consider before. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't just cruelty. This was the architect of her family's destruction laughing at her, testing her, mocking her, without even recognizing the life he had shattered. Her fingers tightened around the cart. She felt it then, not rage, not panic, clarity. Fate had placed her here, on her knees, in front of the very man who had stolen everything from her family. Not to break her, but to remind her who she was. Sophie didn't return home that night the same person who had entered the club, in her small flat. She opened a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were old notebooks neatly labeled, financial models, legal annotations, notes from her father's files, things she had saved because she couldn't bear to throw them away. Hartley Tower documents sat on top. She stayed awake until dawn. She researched Thomas Ashford's acquisitions, tracing patterns with the precision she'd once applied to equations. The same tactics appeared again and again. Aggressive inspections, regulatory pressure, quiet acquisitions at impossible discounts. Hartley Tower wasn't an exception, that IT was a blueprint. And Sophie knew something else now. She had something Thomas didn't expect. Access. Every night, she cleaned rooms where secrets were spoken freely. She overheard timelines, leverage points, vulnerabilities. She understood the language. She recognized the risks others missed. And most importantly, she was invisible. The perfect position. Days passed. Sophie returned to work unchanged on the surface. Same uniform, same lower gaze. But inside, she was rebuilding something long buried. Not revenge. Justice. Thomas noticed her. Though he didn't know why, he found himself watching her movements across the room, irritated by the memory of that napkin. The way she hadn't flinched. The way she'd walked away like the moment meant nothing to IT unsettled him, that he asked staff about her. Got nothing useful. Just a name. Just a cleaner. Good, he thought. Insignificant. Sophie smiled for the first time in years when she heard that, because insignificance was exactly what she needed. She began documenting everything. Conversations, numbers, discrepancies. She cross-referenced them with public records and old legal files. Patterns emerged, ones regulators would care about, ones investors would fear. Hartley Tower hadn't destroyed her father alone. Silence had. And Sophie had decided that silence would end with her. Standing once again in the private dining room weeks later, she looked at Thomas Ashford. Not as a billionaire, not as a monster, but as a man built on fragile lies. This wasn't just humiliation he had offered her. This was fate handing her a second chance. And Sophie Bennett wasn't about to waste it. Sophie did what no one ever noticed her doing. She listened in rooms like these, people believed silence meant ignorance. They believed uniforms erased intelligence. They believed the woman emptying bins and wiping tables couldn't possibly understand the language of power being spoken so freely around her. That belief became their greatest weakness. As a cleaner, Sophie moved through the club like a ghost. She learned which executives drank too much and talked too loudly, which assistants left folders unattended, which men assumed confidentiality was guaranteed once the doors closed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. She remembered everything: names, dates, shell companies hidden behind respectable facades, bribes disguised as consulting fees, safety inspections approved before they were ever conducted, conversations meant for trusted ears spoken openly because no one imagined the cleaner could connect the dots. But Sophie did. She saw documents left behind on tables, financial projections, zoning approvals, internal memos stamped confidential. She didn't take them. She didn't need to. A quick glance was enough. Her memory, once trained for complex proofs and layered models, cataloged every detail. AT home. She reconstructed them. She bought an old voice recorder from a pawn shop with her tips. Small, unremarkable, easy to hide in a cleaning cart. She activated it only when necessary, only when Thomas Ashford or his inner circle were present. She wasn't reckless. She was methodical. Weeks turned into months. And slowly, a terrifying picture formed. Thomas wasn't just arrogant, he was criminal. The massive waterfront development, his next crowning achievement, was being built on lies. Environmental reports falsified. Safety inspections bribed. Investors misled with inflated returns and hidden liabilities. Entire communities displaced through manipulated zoning decisions and quiet payoffs. Hartley Tower had been practice. This was the real prize. Sophie followed every thread. She mapped corporate structures that funneled money through offshore accounts. She matched recorded conversations to transaction dates. She aligned whispered deals with sudden regulatory approvals. Truth, when organized, becomes lethal. Meanwhile, Thomas prepared for his moment. The presentation would be broadcast live, a polished showcase announcing the project to investors, regulators, and the press. He would stand beneath bright lights, framed as a visionary. Applause already felt inevitable. What he didn't know was that Sophie was preparing too. Not a confrontation, not an emotional outburst, something far more dangerous: evidence. She contacted a financial crimes journalist using an anonymous account. She reached out to a regulatory watchdog with a meticulously organized package: documents, audio, timelines. She didn't accuse. She proved. Every claim supported. Every allegation cross-checked. Nothing sensational. Just facts. Cold, undeniable, devastating. And still, she remained invisible. AT the club. Thomas noticed her less than ever. His mind was consumed by cameras, headlines, and legacy. When he passed her in the hallway, she lowered her gaze. As always, he smiled to himself. She was exactly where he believed she belonged. The night before the presentation, Sophie stood alone in the private dining room after everyone had left. The chandeliers were dim. The room felt smaller without the weight of ego filling it. She placed her cleaning cart against the wall and took a slow breath. This was the room where her father had been destroyed without ever stepping inside, where deals were made that shattered lives far beyond these walls, where she had been mocked, humiliated, and underestimated. She didn't feel anger. She felt ready. The next morning, Thomas Ashford stepped onto the stage to applause. Cameras rolled. Investors leaned forward. Journalists prepared glowing headlines. Behind the scenes, regulators watched the live stream. Dossiers open in front of them. As Thomas spoke about transparency, Sophie's evidence began circulating. Emails surfaced, recordings leaked, documents cross-verified. Questions started appearing in real time. Midway through his presentation, Thomas faltered. A notification buzzed on his phone. Then another. His assistant whispered urgently in his ear. The applause died. Reporters raised hands. Not for praise, but for answers. "Mr. Ashford," one called out, "can you explain these environmental violations?" Another followed. "Are these recordings authentic?" A third cut deeper. Did you acquire properties through manipulated inspections? Thomas froze under the lights. For the first time, the man who had laughed at a cleaner felt truly exposed. Back at the club, Sophie watched the broadcast on a small screen behind the bar while wiping down a counter, and no one noticed her smile. The invisible woman had become dangerous, and the world was finally paying attention. The room was packed. Investors filled the front rows, journalists lined the aisles, and cameras captured every angle of the stage where Thomas Ashford stood. His confidence cracked, his voice tightening with every question fired his way. What had begun as a celebration had turned into a public interrogation. Then something unexpected happened. From the side of the room, a woman stood up. She was still wearing her cleaning uniform. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd as Sophie stepped forward, her posture calm, her expression steady. No spotlight followed her. No introduction announced her presence. Yet somehow, the room went silent. "I have a question," she said clearly. Thomas turned, and his face drained of color. Sophie didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse emotionally. She did something far more devastating. She challenged him with facts. She projected numbers onto the screen, numbers that didn't match his own. Cash flows that had been inflated, costs that had been buried, risk assessments quietly erased. She explained each discrepancy with precision, the way a teacher corrects a flawed equation. Then she revealed the plans he had tried to hide. Illegal zoning manipulations, bribe inspections, shell companies designed to absorb blame while protecting the core of his empire. Each claim was supported by documents already circulating among regulators and the press. Thomas tried to interrupt. "Who is this woman?" he snapped. Sophie met his gaze. "The one you called stupid." The words landed like a verdict. Then she played the recording. The room filled with Thomas's own voice, casual, confident, incriminating. Bribes discussed openly. Shortcuts justified. Lives dismissed as acceptable losses. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, but the heavy, irreversible kind. Panic set in fast. Investors checked their phones. Lawyers whispered urgently. Journalists typed without looking up. Within minutes, market alerts flashed. Shares plummeted. Partnerships dissolved. Authorities moved just as quickly. By the time the presentation ended, investigators were already waiting backstage. Thomas Ashford didn't get a closing statement. He was escorted out through a side door, cameras catching the moment his wrists were cuffed. The billionaire who once laughed at a woman on her knees left without applause, only the sound of shutters clicking. Sophie watched from the aisle, and no one stopped her as she walked out. Outside, the air felt lighter. She removed her gloves and let them fall into a bin. For the first time in years, she stood tall, not as a cleaner, not as a victim, but as a woman who had reclaimed her voice. Thomas lost everything in a single day. Sophie didn't gain an empire. She gained something better, freedom. Sophie didn't win because she wanted revenge. She won because she refused to stay invisible. She returned to Cambridge, finished her PhD, and used her mind to protect people just like her father, ordinary people crushed by powerful ones. The world had taught her that status defines worth, but she proved something far greater. Dignity doesn't come from suits or money. It comes from integrity, courage, and truth. The person you overlook today might be the one who changes everything tomorrow. Never judge someone by their job. Never confuse silence with weakness, because sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest storms inside them.